see a real shift now when we're talking particularly of boards of directors, where it used to be it was somewhat of an amorphous answer when they said, what's reasonable in this space, that now you can point to, even if the law isn't necessarily applicable to that company, you can say, well, here are several different laws, here are several different standards that have been widely adapted, and so while we can't say definitively what reasonable is, there is starting to be a baseline that if you do not take certain steps, or if you do not have a very good business reason why you're not taking certain steps, as we see the civil standard develop in suits, you can start to predict, well, courts are going to start to find that that's unreasonable, and certainly if you're in a regulated space, they're going to say that's no longer considered reasonable. Although for a long time, for years, people worried about this being regulated, that in some respects, we're seeing clients be somewhat happy that it's getting a little bit more defined, because it was too hard to shoot otherwise. With 20/20 hindsight, anytime you had an incident, people would blame you.
Right. Well, and look, that's what the big complaint for a long time was about the FTC, that there was no standard. And so the FTC actually, I think, has done a really nice job of laying out, these are our expectations of organizations based on our enforcement actions. And we're starting to see that now in Europe as well, where if companies have a breach, what they're not getting knocked for is that they had the breach, but that they didn't have reasonable security ahead. So how do you put yourself in the position so that you can demonstrate that you have reasonable security is really becoming a core part, right? I mean, you're hearing a conversation about that?
Yeah, and one of the big gaps I think we've both seen and tried to help people with internally is the boards of directors know that they are expected to ask certain questions, and they're hearing again and again that it's going to be their responsibility and boards are going to be held accountable, right?
Right.
And then on the other hand, there isn't, like there would be in the financial sector, a generally accepted standard of how to measure that risk or what reasonableness is. And so trying to translate what it is that the security side is seeing, the risks inherent in new products that are being rolled out, into something that the board can use to discharge its responsibility of oversight. It's been a key theme of the conference right now.
Well, and it makes total sense because there's not even a global agreement, right? So you have a lot of organizations in the US use NIST, but that's really not the standard that's used outside of the US, right? It's ISO 27000 or SOC 2, or just there are so many different standards, and there is not consensus, even on the security side, let alone the privacy side, as to what the standard should be.
No, in fact, you're seeing a lot of, it's a good time for consultants, I guess, but you're seeing what a lot of companies need to do is use 3 or 4 different standards, particularly if they have clients. So they're down the supply chain, because the different customers that they have, the different clients that they have, use a different standard. So
and are demanding it.
Yeah, very much so. So they end up developing a matrix to, on the one hand, talk about what it is that they're actually doing, and then on the other hand, map it against the different standards, so that even though the language is slightly different, you can say, hey, who's ever demanding me meet this standard, I can show you why my current measures do it. And what we find often, post-incident is when you're going back to a regulator, it's HIPAA regulated because it's health information or otherwise, sometimes what you're doing is the company hasn't necessarily thought it through in the way the regulator sees it, but they are actually taking the right steps. So it's a question of then figuring out what they're doing and mapping it into the language that the regulators used to seeing.
But this is one of the big issues which we see all the time, is the actual threats and the technology is so far ahead of the law, right? The laws just can't keep up. So what organizations have to do to try and map it back, so for example, encryption, right? A lot of laws now talk about encryption, but is encryption really the best way? So are we going to now stifle innovation because you have to encrypt, but there are actually better ways? I mean, I think there's been some conversations about authentication too, right? And encryption and those things.